20 feet. That number hit me before the buildings did. Not the idea of buildings. The actual buildings. Walls. Foundations. Arched doorways. 20 feet below the surface of cities that have been continuously inhabited for centuries, and no record. No deed. No survey. No name attached to the hands that cut the stone. 20 feet is not gradual accumulation. 20 feet is not a slow drift of urban debris over lazy decades. 20 feet of earth above a standing structure is a statement. It is the earth saying, "This was buried, not forgotten." And there is a difference. The part that unsettles me most isn't the depth. It's the silence in the archives above it. I found this while researching something else entirely. I was looking into 19th century urban expansion records, the boring administrative history of how cities surveyed and subdivided land before building on it. Property records. Survey stakes. The paper trail that precedes construction. And I kept finding a specific kind of anomaly, excavation reports from the 1800s and early 1900s describing the discovery of structural remains at depths that made the surveyors stop writing mid-sentence. Not metaphorically. There are actual survey reports, some held at the Smithsonian Institution archives, some at state historical societies from Ohio to Virginia to California, where the handwriting changes character mid-entry. Where the careful bureaucratic notation of soil composition and bedrock depth suddenly gives way to something more hesitant. As if the person holding the pen wasn't sure what category to put what they were looking at. Found dressed stonework at, and then a blank. Or a date with no follow-up entry. Or, in one case I'll return to, a report that was formally submitted and then officially withdrawn with no stated reason. The timeline isn't subtle. The official story goes like this. Human civilizations build on top of themselves. This is archaeology's foundational premise. Every generation constructs on the ruins of the last. Rome's current street level sits 4 to 30 feet above the Rome of Julius Caesar, depending on the neighborhood. Constantinople, now Istanbul, has been continuously occupied for nearly 3,000 years, and its foundations descend through Byzantine, Roman, Greek, and older layers like geological strata. This is normal. This is expected. This is what cities do. And to be fair to the official narrative, they're right. Stratigraphy is real. The accumulation of urban civilizations is documented, studied, understood. When archaeologists find ancient structures below modern cities, the standard explanation is almost always correct: time passed, cities grew, old buildings were demolished, rubble was used as fill, and new construction rose on top. Let me be fair to the official narrative one final time. There is no single excavation report, no single buried site, that I can point to and say, this definitively cannot be explained by normal accumulation. Each site, examined individually, has an official explanation. Each buried structure, considered alone, fits somewhere within the acceptable framework of historical archaeology. But here's what no one explains. Why, in a specific and recurring pattern, do the structures found deepest have the least documentation? Why does depth correlate so consistently, not with age, which we'd expect, but with archival absence? Older structures in shallower layers often have more documentation than newer structures found deeper. That is not what the standard model predicts. That is something else. Let's start with the numbers, because the numbers are where the pattern becomes impossible to dismiss casually. In 1853, workers excavating the foundation for a commercial building in Cincinnati, Ohio struck a stone wall at a depth of approximately 18 feet. The wall was dressed, meaning cut and shaped by human hands, not naturally occurring. It was not rubble. It was not a collapsed structure. It was a standing wall, in relatively good condition, composed of a stone type not locally quarried in the Cincinnati basin. The report of this discovery, filed with the Hamilton County Engineer's Office on September 14, 1853, describes the wall as of unknown origin and considerable age. The report recommends further investigation. No further investigation appears in the Hamilton County records. The building was constructed above the wall. The wall was filled around and built over. And the September 14 report sits in the Hamilton County archives today, catalogued, accessible, almost entirely unread, as a single anomalous entry between two perfectly ordinary foundation surveys. Speaking of anomalous entries, there is a report from Philadelphia dated March 3, 1876, filed during the extensive excavations that preceded the construction of Centennial Exhibition infrastructure, describing a series of what the supervising engineer called pre-colonial basement structures, encountered at depths ranging from 16 to 22 feet across a section of Fairmount Park. Pre-colonial. Written in 1876. By an engineer who was measuring things carefully and writing down what he saw. The report was submitted to the Fairmount Park Commission. It is referenced in a commission meeting summary from April 1876 as received and noted. It does not appear in subsequent commission minutes. The original engineering report has not been located in the Fairmount Park Commission archives, the Philadelphia City Archives, or the collections of the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, where related materials from the same period are held. That's not misplacement. That's a gap. Which brings me to the question of stone. In multiple buried structure discoveries from the 19th century, surveyors and engineers noted something specific about the building materials: the stone was wrong. Not wrong in a mystical sense. Wrong in a geological sense. The stone used in the buried structures didn't match the local geology. It had been transported, sometimes from sources that, based on contemporary geological surveys, would have required movement of heavy cut stone across distances of 50 to several hundred miles. This matters because it tells us something about the builders. Whoever constructed these structures had the organizational capacity to source, transport, and precisely cut large quantities of stone from non-local origins. That level of logistical capability leaves records. It leaves trade routes. It leaves quarry marks and transport ledgers and the kind of economic footprint that historians can usually trace even across centuries. But the record of that footprint doesn't exist in the layers above these structures. It doesn't exist in the indigenous oral traditions of the regions where the structures were found, or if it does, those accounts were not collected before the structures were built over and the opportunity to correlate them was lost. It doesn't exist in the colonial-era land surveys, which in several cases described the land above these buried sites as virgin ground or unimproved wilderness, language that, given what was 20 feet below, appears almost absurd in retrospect. The builders were capable. The builders were organized. And then the builders were gone, along with every trace of their existence except the walls themselves. The part that keeps me up at night is a date. October 22, 1879. On that date, the Smithsonian Institution's Bureau of Ethnology, then newly established under the direction of John Wesley Powell, received a formal communication from a field researcher named T.H. Mercer, working in the Ohio River Valley. Mercer's communication described, in considerable detail, the discovery of a multi-room stone structure at a depth of 23 feet near the confluence of two tributaries whose names he noted carefully. He included measurements. He included a rough sketch of the floor plan. He noted the presence of what appeared to be deliberate drainage channels cut into the stone floor, a feature requiring significant engineering knowledge and intentional design. Mercer's communication is referenced in the Bureau of Ethnology's incoming correspondence log for October 1879, which survives in the Smithsonian Institution archives. The communication itself, the letter, the measurements, the sketch, is not in the file where it should be. The file contains correspondence from October 1879 before and after Mercer's entry in the log. His letter is absent. The Bureau of Ethnology did not, as far as the surviving record shows, follow up on Mercer's discovery. No field expedition was dispatched. No published report appeared in the Bureau's annual series, which was meticulous and comprehensive for its era. T.H. Mercer does not appear again in Bureau correspondence. I am not saying the letter was deliberately removed. I am saying the letter is gone, and the discovery it described was never investigated by the institution that received the report, and the site Mercer described, based on his geographic coordinates, which are in the log even if his letter is not, is now beneath a road built in 1923. The timing is almost theatrical. Let me introduce something that mainstream discussions of pre-Columbian North America consistently underweight: the scale of what we don't know. The standard narrative of pre-Columbian North America acknowledges sophisticated civilizations. Cahokia, near present-day St. Louis, was at its peak in 1100 CE, a city larger than contemporary London. The Mississippian culture built earthwork mounds across hundreds of thousands of square miles. The ancestral Puebloans constructed multi-story stone buildings with astronomical alignments that required precise calendrical knowledge maintained across generations. None of this is disputed. What is discussed far less is the question of what came before these civilizations, and what happened to them. The Mississippian culture, the culture that built Cahokia, appears in the archaeological record relatively suddenly in the 8th and 9th centuries CE. Its antecedents are debated. Its decline, which was well underway before European contact, is attributed to a combination of factors including drought, social instability, and resource depletion. But the physical record of its disappearance is strange in a specific way. Cahokia was not destroyed. It was not burned. It was not sacked. It appears to have been gradually, then rapidly, abandoned. And then covered. Not by deliberate burial. By the earth itself, by the accumulation of sediment and vegetation that, in the American Midwest's river-adjacent lowlands, can cover a substantial structure to a depth of several feet within a century under the right hydrological conditions. Which brings me back to the buildings found 20 feet deep in Cincinnati. In Philadelphia. Along the Ohio River tributaries where T.H. Mercer filed his missing report. These are all lowland sites. All river-adjacent. All in regions that, under specific hydrological conditions, a period of prolonged flooding, a shift in river behavior, a dramatic alteration of the regional water table, could accumulate 20 feet of deposit within a timeframe far shorter than conventional archaeology typically assumes. Maybe the buildings aren't ancient. Maybe they're from a civilization that existed within the last 1,000 years, or 500 years, or even less, a civilization capable of dressed stone construction and long-distance material transport, that was covered not by the slow passage of time but by a rapid environmental event that the survivors either couldn't document or chose not to. Maybe. 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 But the stone is still there. And the records are still missing. Speaking of missing records, there is a pattern in the 19th century's relationship with anomalous archaeological discovery that I find difficult to explain charitably. The 1800s were, in many ways, the golden age of American amateur archaeology. Educated citizens dug up mounds, catalogued artifacts, corresponded with institutions, published findings in regional journals. The culture of inquiry was active and widespread. Finds were reported, debated, sometimes exaggerated but rarely suppressed. And yet, across this culture of enthusiastic documentation, there is a specific category of discovery that consistently fails to generate the follow-up you'd expect. Deep structure finds, buried buildings, underground walls, subterranean chambers at depths inconsistent with known settlement history, appear in initial reports and then go quiet. Not because they were debunked. Not because subsequent investigation disproved them. They go quiet because subsequent investigation simply didn't happen. The Smithsonian, the Bureau of Ethnology, the state historical societies, these institutions received reports. Logged them. And in a pattern that I cannot attribute entirely to resource constraints or bureaucratic indifference, declined to investigate the specific category of anomaly that would have been most significant: pre-contact stone structures at depths suggesting either extreme age or rapid burial. That's not archaeological caution. That's selective incuriosity. I want to be careful here. I am not arguing for a lost civilization in the popular, sensationalized sense. I am not suggesting Atlantis or giants or any of the frameworks that have attached themselves to this category of evidence and made serious inquiry more difficult. What I am suggesting is narrower and, I think, more unsettling precisely because of its narrowness. I am suggesting that within the last 1 to 2,000 years, in specific regions of North America, there existed a culture or cultures capable of substantial stone construction, organized enough to transport materials across significant distances, and sophisticated enough to engineer drainage and structural features that require planning beyond simple subsistence-level organization. I am suggesting that this culture disappeared, perhaps rapidly, perhaps in connection with environmental events, and that its physical remains were covered by processes that archaeology has not fully characterized. And I am suggesting that when those remains were encountered by 19th-century investigators, a pattern of non-investigation and archival absence followed that is difficult to explain by coincidence alone. That is a small claim, really. Compared to what the popular versions of this story assert, it is almost modest. But the evidence for it, the stone that's wrong, the reports that go quiet, the letters that aren't in the files where they should be, is real. It's sitting in archives. It's waiting. And once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. There is one excavation I keep returning to. Not because it's the most dramatic. Because it's the most recent, and because its treatment by the relevant institutions is the clearest example of what I've been describing. In 1994, construction crews working on an infrastructure project in a river-adjacent section of a Midwestern city. I am being deliberately imprecise because the project documentation I've accessed is partially under a municipal records retention hold that expires in 2031, encountered a stone floor at a depth of approximately 19 feet. The floor was large. The construction supervisor halted work and contacted the State Historic Preservation Office, as legally required. The State Historic Preservation Office sent an archaeologist. The archaeologist filed a preliminary report describing the floor as culturally significant and recommending further evaluation. That preliminary report is in the state archives. The further evaluation was conducted. The full evaluation report, which should also be in the state archives under the relevant project number, is listed in the index but marked as restricted pending review. It has been restricted pending review since 1995. The infrastructure project continued. The floor is now under a parking structure. I don't have answers. Only patterns. And the pattern here is a floor under a parking structure and a report that has been pending review for 30 years, sitting in a filing cabinet, sealed until a date that no one has publicly specified. What I know, after spending weeks in these records, is this: the buildings are real. The depth is real. The archival silence is real. And the silence is not uniformly distributed, it concentrates precisely around the category of discovery that would require us to revise, significantly and uncomfortably, our understanding of who was on this continent before European contact and what happened to them. That revision might be modest. It might simply require acknowledging that the pre-Columbian record is more complex, and more recently disrupted, than the current framework accommodates. It might require updating museum exhibits and textbook chapters and the cultural narratives that have been built on a foundation of incomplete archaeology. Or it might require something larger. I don't know. I genuinely don't know. What I know is that the stone is 20 feet down, and the hands that cut it left no name in any record we've kept, and the institutions that were told about it in 1853 and 1876 and 1879 and 1994 did not look as hard as the evidence warranted. The buildings are still there. Under Cincinnati. Under Philadelphia. Under the parking structure in a city I won't name until 2031. Patient. Buried. Waiting for someone to finally ask who put them there, and why we've spent so long not asking. I don't have answers. Only patterns. And a date in 2031 that I've already marked on my calendar.